In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about some basic terms for geometry and also show you how we name those items and the notation that we use when we're writing about those items. So the first term we're going to take a look at is the term point. A point is the most basic unit of geometry. It does look just like a dot, and when we're looking at a point, it usually is labeled with some sort of a label, and the label is going to be a single letter, and it's always going to be a capital letter. So we would call this a point. We would call this point A. And if I were writing something about point A, I would simply just write the word point and then use the capital A if I was referring to point A. The next term that we're going to take a look at is a line. A line is made up of points with arrows on each end, which means that because of those arrows, that means that the line extends infinitely in both directions. And of course, a line is straight, no curves. And we can see here what a line looks like. Now, when we are naming a line, we have to use two of the points that are on the line. Any 2 points that are on the line we're going to use to name the line. So this particular line that we have here, this particular line has a couple different names. One of the names we would call this line would be line CB. And again, you can see I just used 2 of the points, and then above the CB we just write a little line with arrows. So that's one way that we would name this line, and we would call that, if I was reading this notation here, I would just call that line CB. Now, I could certainly name that line something else. I could name that line AC if I wanted, because A and C are both points on the line, and that would be another name for this particular line. I could also name this line BC, line BC. And as you can see, we don't have to necessarily go from left to right like we read. We can name lines going in the opposite direction as well. This is also named line BC. Okay, moving right along to our next term. Now we're going to take a look at what are called line segments. Line segments are made up of points with a point on each end. It looks similar to a line, however, there are points on the end rather than the arrows on the end. And because there are points on the end, it does have a beginning and it does have an end. And we call those points on the end endpoints. And of course, a line segment is also straight, just like a line is. So here's what a line segment looks like. We name a line segment similar to how we name a line. We will still use 2 letters that are the points on that line segment. So I could name this line, line segment AB. And notice that this time I just put a straight line over top of the letters A and B rather than a line with arrows on the ends. So that's how we indicate that this is a line segment, and that's how I would read that, line segment AB. Or I could go in the opposite direction and I could name this line segment BA. Okay. Again, if there was another point, let's say D, somewhere on this line segment, I could give it a different name besides the name that I already have used. I could name line segment DB. Now that would indicate, though, that I'm only talking about this piece of the line segment and not the whole entire line segment AB. AB would be a different segment than segment DB is. Okay, so that's a line segment. Moving on to array. Array is made up of points with an endpoint on one end. So we have this endpoint here. And on the other end, we have an arrow, which indicates that the other end extends infinitely in that direction. And it is also straight. So we can see that this is what an array looks like. Array is named similar to how we name a line segment or a line. We do still use 2 letters. However, this time, the first letter is important because it indicates where you are starting the ray at. So for example, I could name this ray AC. And notice the notation that I use there on top of the points A and C. It looks like a ray. Now that's indicating that I want to start the ray at point A and I want to continue on forever in the other direction. Another name for this ray could be ray CB. And that would indicate that I'm starting, rather than starting at point A, I'm now starting it at point C, and then I'm going forever in the opposite direction. But the first letter of the ray name indicates where you're going to start that ray, or in other words, where the endpoint is for that ray. Okay, the last term that we're going to take a look at today is called an angle. And we have a couple angles pictured here. An angle is made up of two rays, so you can see there are two rays that are put together to form an angle, and those two rays share a common endpoint, and that endpoint that they share, that endpoint that they have in common, that is called the vertex of the angle, and the rays that are coming out from that vertex, those rays are called the sides of the angle. Okay, so here we have this angle here that we're going to take a look at. And when we're naming an angle, there are a couple of ways to do that. Generally, when you're naming an angle, you use 3 letters. And you have to have the vertex in the center of those 3 letters. So one way that I could name this angle here would be to call it angle. And I'm just going to use that's my symbol for an angle, and then I'm just going to go in order, starting with S, then over to R, and then down to T. So we would call this angle SRT. And again, notice the middle letter, whatever letter's in the middle, has to be the vertex of the angle. Another way that I could name this same angle here is I could call it angle TRS. And that's also a good name for this angle because I'm starting at T, R is the vertex, which is in the center or the middle letter, and then S, so that is another name for this angle. Now, this angle also has another name, and we can simply just use 1 letter rather than 3. And the 1 letter that we would use would be the vertex. So I could also call this angle R. Okay. Now, the reason that I'm able to use just 1 letter is because in this diagram here, I only have 1 angle. There are no other angles in the diagram. So when I say angle R, it's very clear that I'm talking about this angle right here. Okay. However, if we take a look at this diagram here, we can see that now there are several different angles that are located at vertex R. So when a diagram looks like this one here, you are not allowed to name the angle using just 1 letter like we were up here. So up here, angle R is perfectly fine to name this angle. However, down on the bottom, I would not be allowed to call this angle R. That's not okay. And again, that is because it is unclear which angle I'm talking about in this diagram. There is an angle here. There's another angle here. And then there's a larger angle here. So it's very unclear if I just call it angle R, which angle R am I referring to? So in that particular instance, you have to use 3 letters to name the angles. So let's focus on the first angle that I highlighted here. If I were naming this angle here, I would name that angle SRT. Okay. Let's say that I'm naming this angle here. I would name that angle MRT. T, or I could name that angle TRM. Again, being sure to put the vertex as the center letter. The last thing we need to talk about here are these points that are, that point here, X, point X, and this other point here, point T. We call point X, we say that that is in the exterior. In other words, it's not inside the angle. Okay, it's on the outside of the angle. So we would say that point X is on the exterior. Okay, so that's an exterior point. On the other hand, though, when we're looking at point T, T's on the inside of this angle, angle MRS. So we would say that point T is an interior point. Lastly, sometimes we have points that are on the angle, like S or M. Points M and S are on the angle. Okay. And that's it for our basic terminology for today.